Dr. Erin Marnie is the principal investigator of Entropy's IBS clinical program and one of the lead researchers behind the recently presented Phase 2A study evaluating TRP-8802 in treatment-resistant IBS patients. And Erin joins me today. Erin, thanks for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Alex.
Now, the Phase 2A study delivered a 75% response rate in treatment-resistant IBS patients, significantly exceeding the efficacy typically seen with existing IBS therapies. So, from a clinical perspective, what do you believe is driving this level of response, particularly in a patient population that has already failed multiple treatment options?
So we know that IBS is kind of understood as this disorder of central sensitization. And what that means is that the brain begins interpreting signals from the gut as threatening, even though they should not objectively be deemed threatening. The gut is not actually in danger. There's not actually inflammation in the gut, but a signal is being sent from the gut to the brain that there is pain. This leads to this kind of cycle of hypervigilance, anxiety, and symptom amplification over time, where the CNS kind of overinterprets signals from the enteric nervous system. And we know further that psilocybin acts on serotonin receptors, and they're densely expressed in both the brain networks that process interoceptive signals from the gut and also expressed very widely throughout the gut itself. In fact, the gut is the producer of 90% of the serotonin in the body. And 5-HT2A receptors are primarily what psilocybin acts on and what kind of get all of the glory in psychedelic research, and those are what's responsible for that psychedelic effect. But it's important to also note that psilocin or psilocybin are actually relatively non-specific agonists at other serotonin receptors, including those expressed throughout the gut, and this has really not been widely explored. But we hypothesized that we could kind of transiently disrupt this threat processing that's happening in IBS, and this might allow an opening of a period of window, like a window of neuroplasticity between how the ENS and the CNS are communicating, and with the right therapeutic context, this could be modulated to sort of heal that brain-gut relationship. And as you mentioned, the results, I would say, support that hypothesis. I do want to caveat that this is an open label study. We dosed 13 patients. So, it's not enough to hang your hat on, but the initial data look really, really good and really promising. And 77% of patients met that validated initial clinical response threshold, which is a drop of at least 50 points on the IBS SSS, which is the symptom severity scoring system, I believe. And so a drop in 50 points has been deemed meaningful in other IBS studies. And one thing that I wanted to highlight that's interesting too is that we had many patients who continued to improve at 6 and 12 months of follow-up. Again, despite kind of only getting those 2 doses of psychedelics, it seems to open this window of neuroplasticity and this kind of evolving process that patients can continue to make use out of. Now, the IBS SSS looks at things like belly pain, bloating, satisfaction with bowel habits, and impact on quality of life, and we see all of those things drop. And mechanistically, we see that gut-specific anxiety, which we measured by a metric called the Visceral Sensitivity Index, also dropped significantly and kind of helped predict that drop in the IBS SSS. So what this really seems to suggest is that even though we didn't really directly target the gut, like the therapy was really not focused explicitly on the gut, it seemed to be really changing the way that people with IBS are appraising their gut symptoms in a way that is durable. From what we've looked at so far. And the safety profile was acceptable. There was one serious adverse event of SI, and there were vital sign changes that were kind of expected during dosing and were self-limited. And so I think just to summarize, we think that this could be a really novel therapy for patients, especially those with refractory IBS who have not been helped by other therapies rather. And it seems to be working primarily by changing gut-specific anxiety.
Now, the study found that improvements in IBS symptoms were closely associated with increases in gut-specific anxiety via the VSI, providing support for the gut-brain axis hypothesis. Can you explain why these findings are so important and what they tell us about the underlying mechanisms driving IBS and the potential role of psychedelic-assisted therapies?
As you mentioned, we really looked closely at this visceral sensitivity index, and this is a measure of gut-specific anxiety, which includes like fear and hypervigilance. So it includes things like patients not wanting to go out to eat because they're worried that it will trigger GI symptoms, for example. And this is something that you can really imagine would build up over years of patients having these aversive GI experiences. But that could be very impairing to people's quality of life. And we saw this drop significantly at end of treatment with a mean reduction of about 15 points, very, very statistically and clinically significant. And again, continued improvement throughout 6 months. This is in contrast to some of the kind of more central mechanisms we looked at, such as the AAQ2, which is a measure of psychological flexibility. This actually didn't really change meaningfully, and neither did measures of anxiety and depression, which I think is actually pretty interesting, this dissociation. So it's showing that it's not just making people feel generally better, generally like less anxious about life, but it seems to really be recalibrating how the brain is interpreting and responding to gut signals specifically. And I don't think we necessarily expected to see that going in. So that was pretty surprising and pretty interesting. And, we actually really based the therapy around trying to bolster psychological flexibility. But again, it didn't really change that much. But the symptoms of IBS actually did. A couple interesting findings are that we found psychological insight, which is sort of patients' capacity to derive meaningful interpretation from the psychedelic experience they had, was significantly improved with IBS SSS response. So this really just goes to highlight how important that therapy encounter is, how important the rapport with the therapist is, and really that ability to kind of make sense of what's happened to you from this experience is. We also didn't really see meaningful changes in systemic inflammatory biomarkers, which we measured pre and post. These are things like CRP, IL-6, TNF alpha. These were actually kind of below baseline even at beginning of therapy and didn't really change, which I think just shows that, as we already kind of knew, IBS is not really a problem of systemic inflammation, but is more about central sensitization and brain gut signaling. So I think kind of taking it all together, we have this specific visceral anxiety signal, we have findings of increased insight and meaning making, and we have reduced central sensitization as judged by the IBS SSS, and again, hopefully some interesting neuroimaging and heart rate variability readouts too. I think what we're seeing is that psilocybin seems to really kind of recalibrate the brain-gut axis and change the way that interoceptive processing and GI-specific kind of anxiety and threat processing happen in the brain. And this seems to be, very meaningful and very helpful for many patients with IBS.
And just finally, TRP-8802 has now delivered a strong efficacy signal in treatment-resistant IBS. Given that the TRP-8802 program was designed to inform the development of TRP-8803, Entropy's proprietary IV-infused psilocin formulation, what would you envisage being the key advantages of IV-infused psilocin over oral psilocybin, and how could those benefits translate into improved outcomes for IBS patients?
Yeah, so I've only been a part, obviously, of treating patients with oral psilocybin, so this will be all, a bit speculative. But there are a couple of benefits that I could foresee from using an IV drug. So the most obvious one would be pharmacokinetic. So psilocybin taken orally is actually a prodrug, and its CNS activity depends upon it being converted to psilocin by alkaline phosphatase in the gut and the liver before it can cross the blood-brain barrier. And so that conversion step actually varies quite a bit person to person. So there's very wide variability in onset, peak exposure, and duration. And it's difficult to predict what any given patient's experience of the drug will be because of this. And in fact, we really had times during the study where we felt like people were like maybe getting a totally different drug or a totally different dose, just because the responses seem to vary so much patient to patient. But, the experience between dose to dose within a patient was very consistent. So I think that shows that there wasn't an issue with, the drug itself, but it's just that there's a lot of patient variability that maybe could be overcome with an IV form of the drug that you could titrate more kind of precisely. And that kind of gets to the next point, which is that since you're just delivering the IV psilocin directly, theoretically, as a therapist, you should be able to see this kind of predictable and titratable exposure profile. And so I think, being able to control the pharmacokinetics and being able to control things like how long the patient is under a psychedelic experience begin to matter a lot when you think about kind of scaling this therapy up and commercializing it. And, the other advantage kind of along those lines is controllability from the perspective of the trialist or the therapist. I can envision a world in which you could, for example, stop or slow the infusion if someone was having a difficult experience, or maybe you could increase it if you're trying to deepen the experience, which is not really possible with oral dosing, because once the patient kind of absorbs the drug, they're more or less committed to that experience for the next 6 hours, barring giving, some kind of like abortive agent. And so I think from a safety, tolerability, regulatory standpoint, this could be a significant benefit. But I think it is also important to think that this is a little bit anathema to how psychedelics have traditionally been delivered. So there's been, this one of the kind of ways that we conceptualize psychedelics and people being on this somewhat uncontrollable ride is that we want them to trust and let go and be open to the experience and what it's going to teach them, and teach them that they're okay, even if they're not in control. And that's something that patients, especially with IBS, can benefit from learning. All of us could probably benefit from learning. So I do think we have to balance kind of like that it would be nice to have more control, but also that somewhat not having control is part of the experience. And I'm not totally sure how to message that in terms of the therapy and the patient messaging, but it is an interesting thing to think about. And then finally, IV administration opens the door to kind of more short and precise durations of dosing. So whereas the oral session involves, 6 to 8 hours of so-called tripping, the oral psilocin could be shorter. We think we still don't know how long the psychedelic experience needs to be to generate responses like what we saw here, and that's a question for ongoing study, but could have real implications for kind of healthcare economics and how to deliver this therapy at scale. I think those are the main kind of points that I thought would be beneficial. And you didn't ask me this, but just for the sake of kind of fairness and scientific rigor, I did want to highlight also a couple of potential downsides of IV therapy that we should think about too. So the main one is that IV administration could kind of change the therapeutic environment in ways that matter clinically. So we know that psychedelic-assisted therapy depends very, very much on set and setting, which means that the space that the patient is taking the drug in is designed to feel safe and as non-medical as we could make it. Whereas an IV line, infusion pump, all of these things could really shift the experience in a meaningful way. I think there's also this argument that physical freedom could be important for IBS. So for example, many of our patients during the dosing session would be moving, stretching, even dancing with the therapists. And I think when you think about a condition like IBS, which involves kind of the brain and the gut becoming misattuned to one another, this kind of embodied engagement and this sort of somatic ability to get back in your body is probably part of how it's working. So I do think that's something that we need to think about as we go forward and as we look towards testing this IV form, which I'm very excited to be hopefully a part of that next step. But I do think it's just something that we need to think a lot about how to do in the way that is best for patients. And then also, obviously, IV administration kind of changes like what is needed in terms of nursing staff and support. So I think that's something to think about too when we think about trying to scale this therapy up. And I don't think any of these are deal breakers, but they do highlight why we need new, bigger studies. And again, just to kind of say again that this is all super speculative, but I think there is enough here to really be excited about driving forward for this next phase of study. And I think that should include looking at the IV form of the drug as well.
Erin, appreciate your insights and all the best.
Yeah, thanks.